For nearly 2000 years, humanity has stared into the darkness trying to give it a name. In every century, that name changes. Sometimes it's Nero, sometimes Napoleon, sometimes the machinery of progress itself. The figure we call the Antichrist is never the same, and yet it always feels familiar, as if history keeps recycling the same fear under new disguises. In the earliest Christian writings, the Antichrist was not a person at all, but a condition of the soul. The Apostle John speaks of it in the plural. Many antichrists have come. It was a warning not about monsters in the future, but about something already present within the human heart, falsehood clothed in holiness. Imitation mistaken for truth. Only later, as the centuries turned, did the church and the world begin to imagine a single cosmic villain, a dark mirror to Christ himself. The human mind, Jung would say, cannot endure the idea of absolute contradiction within itself. It must externalize it. So we cast the contradiction outwards, into myth, into prophecy, into someone else. By the Middle Ages, fear had become theology. The Antichrist became a symbol of everything forbidden, everything that threatened the fragile moral order of Christendom. Peasants whispered his arrival. Popes accused rivals of bearing his mark. But notice what happens here. Every time a culture feels that its light is flickering, it imagines the source of the darkness as coming from outside. The Antichrist becomes a convenient vessel for what the psyche cannot admit within itself. Jung once observed, the greater the light, the darker the shadow cast behind it. The more fiercely a faith clings to purity, the more violently it fears its own reflection. By the time we reach the modern age, the names have changed, but the pattern has not. In one century, the Antichrist is a tyrant. In another, he is an ideology or a technology that threatens to replace our humanity. Each age projects its own anxiety into the symbol. For the ancients, it was political decay. For the medievals, heresy. For us, perhaps artificial intelligence or moral relativism. We chase the image through the centuries, convinced that if we can only find and destroy the external enemy, peace will return. But Jung challenges us to turn the mirror around. The devil is the shadow of God, he wrote. And where there is light, there must also be shadow. What if the Antichrist is not history's final villain, but the psyche's forgotten truth, that every ideal carries its inversion, every savior its tempter, every virtue its distortion? When Christianity spoke of the Antichrist, it was giving language to a reality the soul has always known, that good and evil are not two armies, but two poles of one living current. And perhaps that is why the symbol never dies. It mutates because the human mind itself mutates. It survives because we need it. It is the psyche's warning label. Do not look for me outside until you have met me within. To see the Antichrist not as a prophecy, but as a psychic law changes everything. It means that the apocalypse is not a date on a calendar, but a state of consciousness. It means that the end of the world is simply what happens when the unconscious takes back what we refuse to see. And it means that redemption, in the truest sense, begins not in heaven, but in the act of self-honesty. That persistence, the way this symbol refuses to die, is the great clue. It tells us we are not dealing with a superstition, but with an archetype, something woven into the deep structure of the human psyche itself. And to understand that archetype, we must turn to the man who mapped the unseen more precisely than any theologian or scientist before him, Carl Gustav Jung. When Jung published Ion in 1951, he was not merely interpreting theology, he was daring to rewrite it from the inside out. In that book, he proposed something radical, that the Antichrist is not the enemy of Christ, but his shadow, the necessary counterpart that keeps the symbol of light from becoming sterile. In Jung's psychology, an archetype is not a fantasy or invention. It is a deep pattern of human experience, an image through which the unconscious speaks. The Christ archetype, he wrote, represents the self, the wholeness that unites the divine and the human, consciousness and the unconscious, light and darkness, but every image of perfection casts a shadow. And that shadow, Jung said, inevitably takes the form of the Antichrist. He wrote, where there is Christ, there must be Antichrist. The one is the shadow of the other. It was not blasphemy. It was psychological realism. For every striving toward purity, there arises an equal and opposite force toward corruption, not because the world is evil, but because the psyche seeks balance. When one principle dominates, the other rebels from beneath. The more a man identifies with the light, Jung warned, the greater the darkness he will encounter within. Jung saw this drama playing out not just in individuals but in the collective history of humanity. The Christian era, with its exaltation of divine love and moral purity, had repressed the dark half of the psyche for nearly 2 millennia. It had externalized evil into Satan, into the Antichrist, into others. But the unconscious, he said, cannot be split without consequence. What is denied inwardly must one day return outwardly as crisis, as heresy, as war, or as the very end of the age. And this, Jung believed, was already happening in his time. The 20th century, with its genocides, totalitarianisms, and technological dehumanization, was not, in his view, merely political tragedy. It was a psychic event, the shadow of Christian civilization erupting into form. Humanity, he wrote, fell into its own abyss because it refused to integrate the darkness it had cast out for centuries. Yet Jung's message was not despair. It was a call to consciousness. He said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. To face the Antichrist within is therefore not to betray Christ, it is to fulfill him. The Christ symbol, as Jung saw it, is incomplete without its opposite. Consciousness must contain both. Only when good recognizes its own capacity for evil can it become truly moral. So, when Jung speaks of the Antichrist archetype, he is not predicting a future villain, he is describing an eternal dynamic. Every soul, every culture must eventually confront the inversion of its ideas. The Antichrist is that moment when what we worship turns against us, when love becomes sentimentality, when faith becomes fanaticism, when light blinds rather than illuminates. In this way, Jung transforms prophecy into psychology. The coming of the Antichrist is not a cosmic event, but a psychological one. It is the moment when the suppressed unconscious overtakes consciousness, and if we do not recognize it within ourselves, it will appear in the world as fate. Until you make the unconscious conscious, he wrote, it will direct your life and you will call it destiny. So, perhaps the true apocalypse is not the destruction of the world, but the unveiling of the soul. The word apocalypsis means revelation, after all a disclosure, not an end. The Antichrist, in this light, becomes the revealer of what we refuse to see. If that is true, then the question is no longer, who is the Antichrist? But where in me have I created him? And to answer that, we have to understand one of Jung's most crucial insights, that evil, or what we call evil, enters the world through projection, the mind's oldest defense against seeing itself. If Jung's insight about the Antichrist archetype shows us where evil comes from, projection explains why it never seems to belong to us. The psyche, Jung said, has an ancient reflex. It ejects what it cannot bear to recognize. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves, he wrote, we discover in our neighbor. This is projection, the act of hurling our inner darkness onto the outer world. It is the mechanism by which the Antichrist escapes our hearts and takes up residence in other people, other tribes, other ideologies. We condemn in others what we secretly repress in ourselves. The liar despises deception. The arrogant loathes pride. The fearful attacks what feels threatening because it mirrors the terror within. Jung saw projection not as a moral failure, but as a primitive psychological survival instinct. The ego, fragile and small, cannot endure the total truth of the psyche. It builds walls of self-image. I am good, I am moral, I am right, and then exiles whatever doesn't fit those words. But the exiled content does not die. It circles around us like a ghost, whispering through our relationships, politics, and faith. The shadow, Jung said, is that hidden, repressed, and inferior part of the personality which the ego does not wish to recognize. You can see projection at work everywhere. A religious leader preaching purity becomes obsessed with condemning impurity because his own unacknowledged desires are roaring behind the pulpit. A movement claiming to liberate humanity from oppression slowly hardens into tyranny because its rage at injustice masks its own thirst for control. A nation that insists on its moral exceptionalism begins to act as though it stands above the laws of conscience. This is how evil multiplies while everyone feels righteous. As Jung warned, the possession of collective evil begins when individuals refuse to know their own. Once projected, the shadow grows legs. It moves from the personal to the political, from psychology to ideology. Social media becomes its temple. Outrage becomes its liturgy. And because projection operates unconsciously, the louder we denounce the evil out there, the deeper it roots itself in here. We've all felt it, that moral thrill when we find someone to blame. It's addictive, because projection temporarily absolves us. It gives the ego relief, the illusion of purity. But what it actually does is feed the very darkness we seek to destroy. The more fiercely we attack it outside, the stronger it grows inside, until we find ourselves possessed by the very energies we once opposed. Jung often warned that the modern world was suffering not from sin in the old theological sense, but from inflation, a psychic swelling of the ego that mistakes its own judgments for divine truth. The larger the projection, he wrote, the smaller the soul. When a person or a culture becomes so certain of its own righteousness that it can no longer imagine being wrong, the Antichrist has already entered through the back door, not as a demon, but as moral certainty. And yet, Jung did not leave us without hope. He believed projection was not only the cause of evil, but also the key to its redemption. That which we deny in ourselves, he said, comes back to us as fate so that we may learn to know it. In other words, life conspires to return our shadow to us, whether through suffering, conflict, or encounter with the enemy. The person you hate most is often your unconscious trying to get your attention. So, when we see evil rising in politics, in culture, in each other, Jung invites us to ask a different question. What part of me am I looking at? That question alone begins to dissolve projection. It pulls the shadow home, where it can be known, dialogued with, and transformed. This is why Jung considered the Antichrist not a final catastrophe, but a psychological necessity. He forces humanity to see what it has denied. The appearance of darkness is never the end of consciousness. It is its next step. And so, if projection is how evil leaves the soul, integration is how it returns, not to destroy us, but to make us whole. If the Antichrist lives within the psyche as shadow, then his purpose cannot be simply destruction. Jung was insistent about this. Even the darkest symbols carry psychic necessity. The shadow, he wrote, is not a moral problem that must be abolished, but a living part of the personality that must be assimilated. In this light, the Antichrist is not God's enemy, but the soul's corrective, a force that erupts when consciousness grows too narrow, too holy, too certain of its light. Every age of faith produces its heresy. Every ideology produces its candle. That, Jung would say, is the psyche's immune system. The Antichrist symbol is how the unconscious restores balance when consciousness worships its own purity. When the church forgets its humanity, it breeds its own devil. When reason enthrones itself as God, it gives birth to madness. When spirituality refuses the flesh, desire mutinies in the dark. In Ion, Jung wrote that the Antichrist appears when the light has become arrogant. It is the shadow's rebellion against one-sided virtue. And though we may call it evil, its psychological function is closer to medicine, bitter, devastating, but necessary. Without it, morality rots into hypocrisy, faith curdles into fanaticism, and love collapses under the weight of denial. The Antichrist, then, is the psyche's way of saying, you have mistaken half for whole. It comes to destroy illusion, especially the illusion that light alone can save us. Jung warned that when a culture divides itself too absolutely into good and evil, it is on the brink of psychic collapse. The unconscious will not tolerate such fragmentation. What has been exiled as evil returns with vengeance, demanding to be acknowledged, integrated, made conscious. This is why Jung saw the Christian drama not as a single event in time, but as an ongoing psychological process. The crucifixion, the resurrection, and yes, even the coming of the Antichrist, all are stages in the evolution of consciousness. Christ and Antichrist, he wrote, belong together. They form a whole which is both light and dark, the symbol of the self. The moment we attempt to banish the Antichrist entirely, we amputate part of our own being. That is why the Antichrist archetype survives every century. It survives not because humanity loves evil, but because it needs a symbol powerful enough to make it face its disowned truth. It is the psychic volcano that erupts when repression reaches its limit. It tears down false sanctity so that real transformation can begin. Jung once said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The Antichrist is that pain, the rupture of the soul's illusion of moral perfection. He is the teacher who comes when every other teacher has failed. He brings not comfort, but clarity. If we look closely, we can see his work everywhere. In scandals that expose the corruption of piety, in movements that challenge self-righteous systems, in the chaos that dismantles spiritual pride. The shadow does not come to destroy faith, but to purify it. Only what is false burns in that fire. And so, the Antichrist symbol performs one of the most paradoxical functions in the psyche. It protects wholeness by threatening order. It forces consciousness to expand beyond its moral boundaries, to include contradiction, ambiguity, and the unflattering truth. For Jung, this was the hallmark of individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole. Wholeness, he wrote, is not perfection but completeness. So perhaps the Antichrist is not the destroyer of the sacred, but its restorer, the agent through which the soul reminds itself that God is not pure light, but the totality of existence, in which even darkness has its place. And that realization, painful as it may be, is the turning point. Because the moment you understand that your darkness has meaning, it ceases to possess you. The symbol that once terrified you becomes the very sign of your healing. To see this in life, we need to move from theory to example, to look at what happens when people and societies refuse this integration, when the shadow takes control, and the Antichrist steps out of the unconscious into history. If the Antichrist archetype is the shadow of light, then shadow possession is what happens when a person or a culture forgets that the shadow belongs to them. Jung described it as the moment when the autonomous shadow assumes control of the personality. In that state, the individual no longer sins. He is the sin, acting out what he once judged. Consider the believer whose entire identity is built on moral purity. He prays, fasts, condemns the world's corruption, and imagines himself a guardian of holiness. Yet over time, his zeal begins to twist. He feels secretly disgusted by his own desires, his human weakness, his unconfessed anger, and so he hunts them in others. The more fiercely he attacks the impure, the more his own unconscious grows restless. One day, his righteous fury erupts in cruelty, addiction, or scandal. The Antichrist energy, once buried, has broken through. Jung wrote, "What we do not confront in ourselves meets us as fate." The believer's fall is not hypocrisy, it is psychological inevitability. Now look at the collective level. History is full of movements that began in moral light and ended in darkness. A revolution for freedom turns into tyranny. A crusade for justice becomes an inquisition. Each time, the pattern is the same: the refusal to acknowledge one's own shadow. Jung saw in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century a vast psychic possession, the eruption of repressed collective evil. He called it the mass psychosis of projection, where a whole people becomes identified with its ideal and demonizes the other. The larger the crowd, he warned, the lower the level of consciousness. In Nazi Germany, the archetype of the Antichrist did not appear as a horned devil, but as ideology sanctified by moral conviction. A nation that believed itself chosen to purify the world descended into destruction. For Jung, this was not merely politics, it was myth enacted on the stage of history. The Christian era, after centuries of repressing the dark side of God, was forced to meet it in human form. But shadow possession is not confined to the past. It reappears wherever moral certainty becomes total. The same pattern lives in our digital age, where the new pulpits are social media feeds, and the new heresies are opinions that deviate from the collective creed. Outrage becomes a ritual of purification. We cast out sinners not with stones, but with posts and algorithms. Each cancelled figure becomes the scapegoat through which society avoids its own self-examination. Jung foresaw this too. Evil today, he wrote, wears the mask of good intentions. The shadow does not only manifest in depravity, it hides in virtue that has forgotten humility. It is the shadow of progress, of enlightenment, of spiritual pride. The more certain we are of our righteousness, the more likely we are to serve the Antichrist unknowingly. Even in intimate life, the pattern is the same. A man represses his aggression, believing anger to be unspiritual, but that energy returns as passive cruelty, sarcasm, or emotional coldness. A woman suppresses her ambition in the name of humility, and it transforms into envy and resentment. The Antichrist here is not a demonic force, but the inversion of unlived potential, what Jung called the unlived life. In each of these cases, the problem is not darkness itself, but disowning it. The psyche, like nature, abhors imbalance. What is repressed below will erupt above until acknowledged. Shadow possession, then, is not the end of the world. It is the unconscious demanding recognition. It is, in Jung's words, the return of the repressed content in monstrous form. And yet, if possession reveals what we have denied, it also offers us the chance for redemption. The moment one sees the pattern I have become, what I hated, is the moment of awakening. The same fire that destroys can also illuminate. This is why Jung insisted that evil must be faced, not fled. He said the meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. This confrontation is the beginning of the process of individuation. To see the Antichrist within is to begin the path of transformation. The believer fallen into hypocrisy, the movement consumed by its own righteousness, the society devoured by its projections, all of these can be redeemed the same way, through consciousness. When we stop projecting and start owning, the Antichrist ceases to possess us. He becomes what Jung called the dark brother, a teacher, not a tyrant. And so the question becomes, how do we meet this shadow consciously before it erupts in catastrophe? How do we turn the Antichrist from enemy into guide? If projection is how the Antichrist escapes the soul, then integration is how he returns home, not to destroy us, but to transform us. Jung devoted his life to showing that redemption does not come from escaping evil, but from understanding it. We do not become enlightened by banishing darkness, he said, but by making the darkness conscious. So what does this process look like in human life? Not as theory, but as practice. Jung called it individuation, the unfolding of the self through the reconciliation of opposites. The path begins not in triumph, but in humiliation, in the painful realization that the shadow we feared most has always been our own reflection. The first step is recognition. It begins whenever something or someone triggers you deeply, when anger flares, when envy bites, when judgment rises like fire. Those reactions are psychic signals, clues, pointing to the parts of yourself you have disowned. Jung taught his patients to track those moments carefully. What we criticize most violently in others, he wrote, is often an unacknowledged part of ourselves. To feel moral outrage is easy. To ask, why does this disturb me so deeply? That is the beginning of awareness. The second step is dialogue. Jung developed a method called active imagination, in which one allows the contents of the unconscious to speak. In this practice, you might visualize or write to your shadow, perhaps even as a figure, a voice, a face that confronts you in dreams or meditation. Ask it, what do you want from me? What truth do you carry? At first it will accuse, mock, or frighten you, but if you persist with honesty, the dialogue changes. The shadow begins to reveal what it protects: your unlived life, your denied strength, your hidden errors or creativity. The shadow, Jung said, is 90% pure gold. The third step is translation. Once you have met the shadow, you must act on its message. If your darkness expresses rage, perhaps what it truly asks for is assertiveness. If it shows you greed, perhaps it points to unclaimed ambition. If it shows you lust, perhaps it hides a hunger for intimacy or creativity. The task is not to obey the shadow, but to integrate its energy, to convert instinct into insight, compulsion into consciousness. In Jung's language, every content of the unconscious must be lived through and assimilated into consciousness to seize its power over us. The final step is what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. This is the art of living with contradiction, of allowing light and dark, faith and doubt, strength and weakness to coexist without one annihilating the other. It is the crucifixion of the ego, the willingness to suffer paradox rather than cling to purity. Out of the union of opposites, Jung wrote, a third thing arises, the transcendent function which unites them in a higher consciousness. This is the moment when the soul begins to see that good and evil are not enemies but partners in the birth of wisdom. The process is not quick, nor is it pleasant. Integration demands that we face what we most fear and most despise. It dismantles our self-image. It teaches humility through confrontation. But on the other side of that labor lies freedom, not perfection, but wholeness. And that wholeness is contagious. When one person integrates their shadow, their relationships begin to change. Conflict turns into conversation. Judgment softens into understanding. What was once projected outward becomes inwardly owned. The outer world, as if by magic, grows less demonic because the inner one has been reconciled. This is why Jung believed shadow work is not merely psychological therapy, but a spiritual act. It redeems evil by transforming it into consciousness. The very energy that once possessed you becomes your creative fuel. your compassion, your discernment. The Antichrist becomes your teacher in humility, the one who shows that redemption begins not in heaven, but in self-knowledge. And yet, Jung also saw that this task was not only individual. The fate of civilizations depends on the same law. A world that refuses its shadow will project it onto enemies and destroy itself. A world that faces it may yet transform. What happens when a whole civilization refuses to face its shadow? The same thing that happens to an individual: repression, projection, and eventual possession. Jung warned that the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. When we deny the darkness within, we summon it into history. The wars of our century, the ideological frenzies, the digital crusades, all are symptoms of a humanity that has not met its own Antichrist. The collective shadow is not a metaphor. It is the accumulated psychic refuse of billions of unexamined lives. Every prejudice, every hatred, every moral inflation that we refuse to own becomes part of that vast invisible reservoir. And when it bursts, we call it politics, war, or crisis. Jung saw this long before our time. Writing after the Second World War, he said the greatest danger to mankind is not the bomb, but the psyche of man himself. He meant that our technologies only amplify what we have not integrated. The more powerful our tools become, the more catastrophic our projections. The apocalypse in Jung's sense is not divine punishment. It is the unconscious running the world through human hands. We can see it in the endless cycles of polarization that define our era. Every side believes itself righteous. Every side sees the other as the Antichrist. Political tribes, religious movements, even scientific communities, each identifies with its own light and demonizes the opposing shadow. The result is psychic fragmentation on a global scale. When two people meet, Jung once said, the collision of their shadows often decides the outcome. How much more so when entire nations collide? The collective shadow shows itself not only in open conflict, but in the quieter forms of despair, the loneliness beneath digital connection, the cynicism that replaces trust, the numbness that follows constant outrage. These are symptoms of a world estranged from its inner life. When consciousness becomes externalized, when value depends on image and identity on opposition, the Antichrist archetype reigns unseen. Religions have always intuited this danger. Every apocalypse myth warns of a time when humanity will worship its own creations. Jung interpreted this not as prophecy, but as psychological law. Whatever man does not become conscious of appears to him as fate. Today our gods are algorithms, economies, and ideologies. We serve them as though they were transcendent, but they are only the outer forms of our unconscious powers. Yet Jung's vision was never despairing. He believed that the same energy that produces destruction can, when made conscious, produce renewal. The world, he wrote, hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the human psyche. The redemption of society begins in the transformation of the individual, but once enough individuals awaken, the collective itself begins to heal. The antidote to mass projection is mass introspection, not conformity, but consciousness. When a person integrates their own shadow, they withdraw their energy from the collective hysteria. They stop feeding the archetype of the Antichrist with fear and moral certainty. They become a point of stillness in the storm, a soul through which consciousness enters history. Jung believed this is how civilizations are saved, not by heroes, but by individuals who refuse to participate in unconsciousness. If a world-saving change is possible, he wrote, it will spring from a change in the individual. So perhaps the true apocalypse is not the end of the world, but the end of unconsciousness. The war between Christ and Antichrist is fought not on battlefields, but within the human soul. Each time we demonize an opponent instead of examining our own darkness, the Antichrist wins another small victory. But each time we recognize ourselves in the other, the self, the image of wholeness, grows stronger. And this is Jung's final warning and promise. The apocalypse will not come by God's hand, but by human unconsciousness, and it will be averted only by consciousness. The shadow, when faced, becomes light, but when denied, it becomes the world's destroyer. To glimpse this reconciliation, the union of light and dark, of Christ and Antichrist within one consciousness, is to approach Jung's most daring insight, that salvation does not come from separating good and evil, but from holding them together in awareness. When Jung looked into the Christian myth, he did not see a simple war between good and evil. He saw a drama of the self of consciousness evolving toward wholeness through the reconciliation of opposites. Christ and Antichrist, he wrote, represent the two halves of the divine whole. They are not enemies but polarities, the tension through which the soul awakens. To the literal mind, this is scandalous. We are taught that light must conquer darkness, that purity must defeat corruption. But the psyche operates by another law. Every extreme invokes its opposite. Every rejection becomes possession. Jung said, there is no energy without polarity. Without the tension of opposites, there is no movement, no life. What religion calls redemption, psychology calls integration. In Ion, Jung described the image of Christ as the archetype of the self, the symbol of divine wholeness. Christ represents consciousness ascending toward unity, toward love and order. But an archetype cannot manifest fully unless its shadow is also included. The Antichrist, then, is not a mistake in God's plan, but part of it, the necessary revelation of what remains unredeemed. The light creates its own darkness, Jung observed, because it cannot exist without opposition. To recognize this is to begin to see divinity itself differently. God is not pure light opposed to darkness, but the totality that contains both. In this sense, the Christ-Antichrist tension is not a cosmic duel, but a mirror of the self's own evolution. Consciousness expands when it can hold paradox without splitting. Jung called this the mandala of opposites, a circular symbol where Christ and Antichrist are not enemies but partners in the birth of a higher unity. Imagine a mandala. In one quadrant, the radiant figure of Christ, symbol of compassion, order, spirit. In the other, the dark reflection, the Antichrist, symbol of instinct, chaos, matter. Between them lies the crucible of consciousness. The ego is pulled apart until it learns to contain both without collapse. Out of that tension emerges what Jung called the transcendent function, a third, unifying state of awareness that is neither light nor dark, but the conscious holding of both. This is the secret meaning of apocalypse, not destruction, but revelation, the unveiling of the whole. The second coming, Jung suggested, would not be another figure descending from the sky, but the awakening of this unity within human consciousness. The coming of the self, he wrote, is always a defeat for the ego. The Christ returns not as a person, but as a psychic event, the birth of awareness that can embrace its own shadow. To experience this synthesis is to understand that evil is not eradicated, but redeemed, transformed from an unconscious compulsion into a conscious responsibility. We stop blaming the devil because we see that the devil was the part of God that demanded inclusion. Jung wrote, God is born in the soul when the opposites are reconciled. This insight changes the very meaning of faith. It moves from belief in dogma to participation in a living process. Faith becomes the courage to face paradox, to stand between heaven and hell, and recognize both as inner realities. Morality evolves from rule to relationship. Salvation shifts from escape to awareness. The Christ-Antichrist synthesis is not the end of religion, but its fulfillment. The moment when love grows wise enough to include its own shadow. In that light, The old war between good and evil loses its terror. The Antichrist is no longer the destroyer of the sacred, but the dark twin that reveals its hidden depth. Together, they form a whole consciousness that knows both its divinity and its limitation, its compassion and its cruelty, its light and its darkness. This is not moral compromise, but spiritual maturity. Jung said, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the opposites. And perhaps this is the deeper meaning of Christ's own paradox, that to save the world, he had to descend into it. The divine had to enter matter, to experience separation, suffering, and death. Only then could the resurrection have meaning. In the same way, consciousness must enter its own darkness to know the light that does not burn. So when Jung says the next Christ event will occur in the human soul, he is not predicting a savior, but a shift, a new form of awareness in which humanity learns to hold its shadow without fear. The apocalypse, then, is not the destruction of the world, but the transformation of perception. And if that is true, then every act of honest self-reflection, every moment of compassion toward one's own darkness, becomes a step toward collective redemption. The divine drama continues, but now we are conscious participants. Now that we have seen how the Antichrist lives within the psyche, not as an enemy, but as a forgotten half of the self, the question becomes practical. How do we meet him? Jung believed that insight must become experience, or it remains dead. Knowing your darkness, he said, is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. The work begins not in the outer world, but in the quiet interior where our unspoken truths dwell. Find a time when you can be alone, not as an act of isolation, but of listening. Sit in silence. Let the noise of your daily mind settle until a faint presence stirs beneath it. That presence is not peace at first. It is discomfort, restlessness, perhaps even fear. Stay with it. This is where the shadow lives, not in dramatic visions, but in the tension between who you think you are and what still demands to be seen. Now, imagine a figure appearing before you, not a literal being, but a living symbol formed from what you most reject. It might look familiar. A face that reminds you of your anger, your jealousy, your failures, your unlived longings. This is your personal Antichrist, the shadow that your consciousness has exiled. Look at it without judgment. Notice what emotions arise: fear, disgust, sadness, curiosity. Breathe through them. Remember, this is not an enemy but a messenger. Ask this figure one question: what truth do you carry for me? And wait. You may hear words, see images, or feel an emotion stir. Whatever comes, do not argue. Receive it as you would receive a dream. Jung often said that the psyche speaks in symbols, not sentences. Perhaps it shows you a flame, meaning passion you have suppressed. Perhaps it shows you a wound, pointing to tenderness you have neglected. The shadow does not moralize, it reveals. When the image fades, write down what you saw and felt, then translate it into life. If the message was anger, perhaps it means you need to assert yourself honestly. If it was envy, perhaps it shows where your unlived potential lies. If it was fear, perhaps it is calling you to courage through vulnerability. Each shadow contains an energy that, when acknowledged, becomes creative. Jung said, the gold is in the dark. What we integrate ceases to poison us and begins to nourish us. This practice is not done once. It is a rhythm, a lifelong conversation between ego and shadow, light and dark. Some days the dialogue is tender, other days it is brutal. But with time, the boundary between you and your darkness softens. The figure that once frightened you becomes a guide, a source of strange wisdom. Eventually, you will begin to sense that this dialogue is not just personal. The moment you redeem one fragment of your own darkness, the world itself grows slightly less divided. Every inner reconciliation contributes to the collective one. Jung wrote, "The salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul." When enough souls integrate their shadows, the archetype of the Antichrist loses power over the collective mind. The apocalypse cools into awareness. So take this as a simple practice. Once a week, sit with your inner adversary. Listen. Record what it says. Translate its energy into an act of creation, compassion, or honesty. You do not cast out the Antichrist. You redeem his energy. You transform the devil back into the angel he once was, the part of you that carried the light before you divided it. And when enough hearts learn this art, something larger begins to shift, for the shadow that once ruled from the unconscious finds its throne dismantled by consciousness itself. When an individual integrates their shadow, they reclaim a fragment of the world's soul. But when many individuals do it, something extraordinary begins to occur, what Jung called the compensation of the collective unconscious. The same psyche that once produced war, division, and apocalypse begins to reorient toward wholeness. The myth changes shape. Every age lives within its own mythology, even when it thinks it has outgrown them. Today, our myths no longer wear halos and robes, they appear on screens, in algorithms, in headlines. We have traded prophets for influencers, scripture for data. Yet beneath these modern idols, the same archetypal drama unfolds. The struggle between the conscious and the unconscious, between Christ and Antichrist, creation and chaos. When the collective shadow is unintegrated, the world becomes feverish with prophecy. Every crisis feels like the end, every change a sign of doom. That is because the apocalypse has moved from scripture into psyche. Jung saw this clearly. The apocalypse is the symbolic expression of the unconscious breaking into consciousness. In other words, what we once imagined as the end of time is actually the moment when time becomes aware of itself, when humanity begins to see its own soul. Our media panic, our prophecy addiction, our obsession with artificial intelligence, with collapse, with utopia, all of these are modern forms of the same archetype, the longing for renewal through destruction. But Jung would remind us that destruction is only half the symbol. The other half is revelation. The world will not be saved by purity, he wrote, but by consciousness. When consciousness expands, myth transforms. The Antichrist ceases to be an external monster and becomes an inner principle of transformation. Apocalypse turns from catastrophe into evolution. The very energies that once threatened civilization become its creative fuel, just as volcanic ash enriches the soil after eruption. Imagine for a moment a society that no longer projects its evil but dialogues with it. A culture that sees its conflicts not as wars to be won, but as shadows to be integrated. Its politics would be wiser, its religions humbler, its technologies more humane. It would still struggle, still err, still fall into darkness, but it would do so consciously. And that makes all the difference. This is Jung's quiet prophecy, that the next Christ event will not occur in history, but in the human soul. The Redeemer will not arrive as a single figure, but as a collective awakening, a gradual, dawning realization that we are responsible for the gods we create. Man's task, Jung wrote, is to give birth to the divine in himself. The moment enough people begin this inner work to hold their shadow, to transform projection into understanding, the myth of apocalypse begins to dissolve. The world does not end, it awakens. And this awakening will not look spectacular. It will happen in small human acts, a conversation that replaces condemnation, a moment of empathy instead of outrage, an artist turning pain into beauty rather than blame. These are not minor gestures. They are tectonic shifts in the collective psyche. They are how myth evolves, not through revelation from above, but through consciousness rising from below. So, when you next encounter the world's chaos, remember, you are not watching the end of history. You are witnessing the soul trying to remember itself. Every confrontation with darkness, every breakdown, every moral crisis is part of the same process, the psyche striving for wholeness. In this way, the Antichrist, once feared as humanity's destroyer, becomes its redeemer in disguise, for he forces us to awaken to the truth that salvation has never been about escape, but about consciousness. We began with a question. What if the Antichrist isn't out there? Now we see what Jung saw, that the answer is not an argument, but a mirror. The Antichrist, the shadow, the enemy, the apocalypse, all are names for what happens when consciousness refuses its own depth. The moment we stop looking outward for villains and begin to look inward for understanding, the myth shifts. What once felt like an ending reveals itself as a beginning. Jung wrote, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. To know the divine, we must know the demonic in ourselves." The task of consciousness is not to purify the world of evil, but to recognize that good and evil are threads of the same fabric woven into being itself. Only when we hold both with awareness do we transcend both. So, when you find yourself asking, where is the Antichrist? Pause. Look not at the world's corruption, but at your own moments of judgment, fear, and denial. Ask, what part of me have I sent into exile? Each act of self-honesty is an exorcism. Each admission of shadow is a prayer. This is the secret Jung left for those willing to hear it. The apocalypse is not destruction, but revelation. The end of the world is the end of unconsciousness. What rises in its place is not utopia, but consciousness, simple, luminous, painfully awake. If we can bear that awakening, if we can meet our own Antichrist without hatred, we begin to see what Jung meant when he said, the self is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. Every soul that becomes whole adds one more light to that circle, and together those lights form the mandala of a redeemed humanity. So let this be your remembrance. You do not fight darkness. You illuminate it. You do not destroy the shadow. You listen to it until it transforms. The more we dare to do this in our hearts, our families, our cultures, the more the world itself begins to heal, because consciousness spreads like light, one heart at a time. If this helped you see darkness differently, share it, speak it, live it. Light spreads not by preaching, but by presence. And remember, when the Antichrist is no longer out there, the second coming has already begun in you. And in the next journey, we'll explore the map that Jung drew for that inner transformation, the one he called soul versus spirit, the key to surviving the apocalypse within.